started, that
Yeah.
if you were to ask people to listen to this,
That's
I'm
plenty.
guessing that this is not.
What I'm gonna do is put all of the gluten-free in one, because there's 2 kennels per 6.
Sandy, have you guys, what you guys are saying is being picked up by the mic, so it's remarkable.
How's that? There you go. Yes, that's much better. Okay, so as I was saying, if you were to ask people for a list of mystics, and if they even knew what you were talking about, it's likely that St. Francis of Assisi would not make that list, because that's not what he is most known for, which is like preaching to the birds, or a statue in the garden, or something like that. He's associated with creation a lot. But we're going to see how all of that is really rooted in his contemplative mystical roots. And I'll say more about that as we go on. The other thing I wanted to say before we started, based on a couple of questions and comments that I had at the end of last week. So mysticism, as I've defined it, which is simply being present to the God who is always already present to us, coming into that presence. This is something that is taught by all of the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Muslims. May not be emphasized any more than it is in Christianity, but it forms a part of the spirituality of those 3 religions. It is also a big part of Buddhist spirituality, in which it is a much more prominently taught understanding of how to relate to God. But I just wanted to kind of give you that universal notion of it. And it's part of why I think Richard Rohr talks about contemplation as part of the perennial tradition. It's something that kind of permeates and renews itself kind of in a universal way throughout the world. The other thing I wanted to say was about practice. I had mentioned that one of the things that can be helpful in contemplative prayer, if you find your mind wandering, is to count, like count your breath. 1, 2, just focusing on the number, which is a way of emptying your mind of other things. The suggestion that I have is don't go past 10, because what happens is if it works, you're going to kind of get caught up more in a prayerful moment, and you're going to lose track of the number. So just go to 10 and start over again. No sense in trying to keep track of counting infinitely. All right, so before we talk about Francis's kind of spirituality and what his spirituality has for us today, let me give you a brief biographical sketch. Much of this is probably well known. He was the son of a prosperous silk merchant, so he grew up rich at a time when there was great disparity in wealth during the Middle Ages. You can see his dates there. He's one of our earlier people that we'll be talking about. He lived a very lavish, carefree lifestyle, and like many of the young men his age, he was caught up in the notion of what's called courtly love, okay? A romanticized ideal of the relationship between men and women, the love poetry, the troubadours, all of that, which you're familiar with from history. Francis was right in the middle of all of that as a young man growing up. He joined the military. Again, if you remember your history, there was no Italy really at this time. There were all these various states or principalities within Italy. And so they were always at war with one another. And he fought in a few of those wars. But in around 1205, as best as we can determine, he grew disillusioned with the notion of war, and he also had some kind of religious experience in which he heard God tell him to rebuild my church. That's a key moment in the development of Franciscanism, or Francis's change in lifestyle. So this led to a renunciation of his father and his inheritance. He got rid of all of his fancy clothing, he wore a simple garb, and wandered around Assisi preaching. Some of you are probably old enough to remember a movie, and Franco Zeffirelli actually made it, called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Anybody seen that movie? It's back in the 70s, I think. There's a famous scene in that movie which seems to have some historical significance, although biographical information about Francis is hard to be certain about, just as biographical information about Jesus is hard to be certain about, because a lot of what was written about him by his earliest followers probably, mythologized some things and told some stories that maybe were not quite true in the sense that we would talk about factually true, but had a truthfulness at a deeper level. At any rate, there's a famous scene in that movie where Francis takes off all of his clothes in the middle of the public square as a way of renouncing his father, and the bishop is there, and the bishop covers him with this cloak that the bishop is wearing. And again, we don't know if this actually happened or not, but it's become symbolic of how the bishop, who was probably more concerned about public nudity than anything else, was kind of covering Francis in the mantle of the church without maybe realizing the potential symbolism of all of that. So Francis took very literally this notion of rebuild my church, and he started to rebuild a church called San Damiano's, which is in the countryside right outside of the walled city of Assisi. It still exists today. It's decades since I was there. My recollection, I was thinking this morning, it may not have had a roof, but it's still maintained by the Franciscans, the first church that Francis was associated with. In time, of course, Francis began to see that mission in a different way about rebuilding the church, and we'll talk more about that. Within 3 years of Francis beginning this kind of construction on his own of San Damiano's, a band of followers began to associate themselves with him. And Francis called them, in Latin, the fratres minores, the little brothers. Okay, and that's going to be very critical in understanding Francis's theology and spirituality going forward. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, of course, there was a lot of opposition to Francis because here he is doing all of this stuff. He doesn't really have anybody's permission to do it. This is the time when religious orders, as they existed in the church, were monastic. So we're talking about the Benedictine monasteries, these huge monasteries that owned land and vineyards and all sorts of, were involved in all sorts of commerce. So here comes this guy, and he's not really interested in any of that. He's just preaching the gospel, and he's helping the poor, and he's talking about how we need to love one another. And so opposition grew to him rather strongly within Italy, and that opposition got as far as Rome. Francis was called to Rome in around 1210, and the Pope, Innocent at the time, his plan was to tell Francis, enough of all of this, stop it. But then, again, according to the tradition, according to the story, Innocent had a dream the night before he met Francis, in which he saw this beggar man holding up the church. The church was tilting, and this guy was holding the church up. And that changed Innocent's mind, and he gave Francis permission to continue his work. Just a couple of other things to say about Francis in terms of a biographical sketch. We know that Francis crossed into Islam and preached to the Sultan in around 1219. We don't know anything about what happened during that conversation, but it would be very rare for a Christian to go to the Islamic Empire. It would be even more rare for them to come back if they went there. So Francis managed to accomplish that, okay? And as I said, we don't really know much about this meeting other than the fact that it was pretty unique in the history of the times. Francis died in 1226, and within 2 years he was canonized. Now, I don't know what the rules for canonization were back then. Now you have to have a miracle attributed to you and things like that. But it's a testament that the speed with which this happened was a testament to how Francis had caught the popular imagination of at least the Italian world. And so his holiness was something that seemed to just permeate people's understanding of him. I did want to make note of the fact that there are Anglican Franciscans. We tend to associate Franciscans with the Roman Catholic Church, but there are Anglican Franciscans. I think they're called the Grey Friars, is that correct? I think that's what they're called. The essence of Francis's lifestyle, you see by that arrow there at the bottom, was a concrete imitation of Jesus. He wanted to live as Jesus lived. And scholars of religion tend to believe that Francis is probably the best exemplar of somebody who followed Jesus literally in the whole way he lived his life and in terms of his preaching. All right, so now let's talk about his spirituality. So as I mentioned, Francis is associated with creation. And most famously, you see that in the prayer that is attributed to him, the Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon prayer that we've all heard and we've sung it in various ways. This love of creation was based on an intimate experience of God's love for all creation, of God's presence in all creation. Last week, I introduced the term panentheism. Again, this is not a term that Francis would have been talking about. But the idea here is that God is in everything and revealed through everything. And that creation is really God's first revelation of God's self to the world. This is something that Paul says also in Romans. But it's a profoundly important idea when you think of the medieval church, which was very hierarchically oriented, and it was about finding God within the church and finding God by following the rules of the church. Francis is saying, God's everywhere. Just open your eyes, and you're going to see God in all of creation. And you're going to see that God profoundly loves all of creation, and that we are part of that creation and related to that creation as brothers and sisters, which is why he can talk about Brother Sun and Sister Moon and all of that, because the relationship is that intimate with creation. And of course, so it's no surprising that Francis is associated today with the environmental movement, and I think he may even be the patron saint in the Catholic tradition of the environment. This notion of God's presence in creation and the kind of what I would call a key element of Franciscan spirituality is something that you've probably been exposed to in many ways without thinking about it necessarily in relation to Francis. So who here ever studied Gerard Manley Hopkins in an English class? Anyone? Charles? Okay. Maybe Catholic school and seminary had more to do with it than but he was a Jesuit, actually, an American. And I just want to read to you a part of one of his most famous poems called God's Grandeur. And you're going to see the Franciscanism in this poetry. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. And for all of this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods, with warm breast and with bright wings. So that's a lot of what I was saying last week about how the contemplative mind understands the presence of God at the heart of the universe, at the heart of all creation, and the Holy Spirit in our own hearts, which opens us to this presence of God everywhere. Now, the poem has many more stanzas, but I wanted to just emphasize those points. Gerard Manley Hopkins. The other thing that I didn't really remember this until I started preparing for this series, the Franciscans kind of invented the Feast of Christmas. It was not a big deal in the early church, which rightly focused more on Easter. But Francis had this notion, which was later developed by some of the Franciscan theologians, St. Bonaventure in particular, that the very incarnation of God was already the redemption of humanity. That if you accept God's embrace of humanity in the incarnation, that he's taking on our flesh in all its frailty, in all its weakness, in all its proneness to miss the mark and go the wrong way, that's redemption already. And kind of resurrection would just naturally be the outcome. So this became a development within Christian theology called original goodness. Instead of focusing on original sin, focusing on original goodness, and focusing on the fact that incarnation itself is redemptive. Okay? So it's not saying that the cross and resurrection are important. It's simply trying to talk about the fact that this embrace that God had of the world in the incarnation was already a redemptive act. And this notion, again, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but this notion of God's embracing the world and embracing humanity in the incarnation, making God's presence felt in the reality of creation, is the formative understanding that Francis brought and the formative understanding of his approach to contemplation. Francis would say, if you want to understand God, just go walk out in the forest, go walk out into the fields, and as Gerard Manley Hopkins would say, you will see that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. All right. Now, another element of Franciscan spirituality that's very important, and the one that perhaps led to him getting more in trouble originally, was this notion of the minores, the marginalized people. So these early brothers lived in complete poverty. They begged. I often think about the fact that we have garden statues of Francis of Assisi, but if he actually showed up at our houses, we'd probably call the police. Remember, he lived at a time when people didn't bathe very often anyway, even the wealthy people, but they, of course, covered themselves in perfume. Well, he didn't do that. So he would have been a dirty, grungy, beggar-looking kind of person if he showed up in the house. Probably not the person you would think of ending up as a statue in your garden. So I think it's important to keep that perspective in mind about Francis. Remember also that, as I said earlier, he grew up during a time when courtly love was very important. And what he ended up doing was adapting that notion of courtly love to a figure that he called Lady Poverty. So he had a love affair, if you will, with Lady Poverty. So what does that mean? Well, of course, it meant literally to live poorly, but really what the Franciscan notion of poverty means is an absolute dependence on God. Not worrying about tomorrow, not even worrying too much about today, but having this absolute dependence on God, who is suffused through all of creation and is present and loving you through all of creation. If you see that connection, it becomes easier to understand how he moves to this absolute dependence on God because of his notion of God. And then this notion of the menores, the little ones, that probably the best translation of that in our age today is the marginalized. Francis was associated with the marginalized of his society. He was ministering to the lepers. He was dealing with the poor. He was dealing with the people who needed help the most. And that was his command, if you will, his rule for his followers, is that they were to live there, to live with the menores, and to be associated with them, to be among them. And again, keep in mind, when Francis finally is successful and gets the Pope's permission and the order begins, this is the beginning of what's called the mendicant movement in the history of the church. So it's away from the monasteries. The clergy up until that time was either associated with the parish church or the cathedral or the monasteries out in the countryside. But the mendicants went into the cities and just preached to everyone, okay? And they sought out especially those most in need. So this emphasis on the marginalized, we might see another example of that. Again, I'm not saying it was a conscious one, but Bishop Buddy gave that sermon in front of President Trump in January, in which she urged him to have compassion for those who were fearful, the marginalized, the migrants, the transgender youth. Those are the kind of people that are marginalized today. Those are the kind of people that Francis calls our attention to. The last point that I would emphasize in terms of Franciscan spirituality is humility. Francis never sought orders. He kind of eschewed the whole authoritarian kind of structure of the church. And he really, he didn't, the term that was used for the person in charge of religious orders during Francis's lifetime, and still today for most religious orders, was superior general. Francis said, no. We're going to use the term minister general, because the purpose of the leaders of our movement is always to take care of everyone else in the movement. It's not to be above them. It's not to be a kind of hierarchical thing. It's the notion of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples at the Last Supper. And the Franciscans today still use the term minister general. They're the only religious order, to my knowledge, in the Catholic Church that still uses that term. He also strongly encouraged his followers not to take positions of authority in the church. So normally, to become a bishop, you were a diocesan clergy. You were somebody who worked in a parish, or you worked in the cathedral. Sometimes abbots of monasteries would become bishops. Francis said, I don't want you guys doing that, because I want you to be, this is my language, but I think it reflects Francis's spirit. I want you to be inside the church, but I want you to be on the edge of the inside, because I want you to be a critique of what can happen with over-institutionalization of religious thought and over-institutionalization of God. The Franciscans, unfortunately, over the centuries, did not follow Francis on that. And perhaps some of you are familiar with, I don't know if he still is, but the Roman Catholic Archbishop and Cardinal of Boston, whose name I'm blocking on right now. His first name is Sean, but I can't remember his last name. He is a Franciscan. He was a close advisor to the Pope. He may have retired from Boston. But so obviously over time, the Franciscans gave that up. And I think there are some Franciscans like Richard Rohr who would probably say, we made a mistake doing that. We lost some of our original legitimacy, some of our original intent when we became too identified with church structure, because we're always called to be on the edge of the inside. And if you think about it, the edge of the inside is a wonderful image, because the edge of the inside is focused inside, and it's focused on helping the church remain true to its vision. But the edge of the inside is also able to see outside more easily, to see where things might expand a bit and move in different directions. An example of that, I think, is the current Pope, Francis, who, shocked everyone by choosing the name Francis. It had never been done before. And one of his first official acts as Pope was to go someplace in Italy, it might have been Sicily, to welcome migrants who had just been, crossing the Mediterranean Sea at great risk. And he's talked about the need for the church to think of itself as a field hospital. These are very Franciscan comments, even though the Pope was a Jesuit before he became Pope. So this spirit of Francis pervades the church. At least I can only speak more directly from the Catholic Church, because he captures something about the religious imagination of humanity, the centrality of God, God's presence in creation, God's concern for those who are marginalized, God's desire that the church always reform itself and be open to new ways of understanding itself. And I think this is part of the reason that he continues to have appeal. And it's amazing the number of people who have written biographies of Francis, from scant biographical sources. The earliest biographical sources were from people who were contemporaries of Francis. And so that's where we get some of the stories about preaching to the birds, which may be true, I don't know. There's also the famous story of the wolf of Gubbio. Anybody heard that story? There was this wolf that was terrifying this village called Gubbio. They called Francis. Francis went out and talked to the wolf, and the wolf decided to leave the village alone. Probably didn't happen, I don't know. Could have, but the point is, you see in there, even in that story, you see the things that are essential to Franciscanism: brotherhood with creation. He can talk to the wolf. Concern for those who are being, hurt or left unprotected by getting the wolf to go away, but keeping a notion of the unity of creation. So I'm going to stop there so that you have time for questions. I'll end with this last point I forgot to mention here, which is the last arrow, that maybe the way to sum up Francis' spirituality is through a union with God in all creation. So a union with God in all creation, we are prompted to act, to care for all creation, and especially for those at the margins of society. That's Franciscan spirituality in a phrase or two. Okay. Anyone have any questions or comments or disagreements? Or yes?
I have the mic here, and no one likes the mic other than the people who are watching it on live stream, so please.
There's a Franciscan facility in downtown Washington, isn't there? I think Barb has an uncle who went to a retreat there. What can you expect if do you sign up for a retreat, a contemplative retreat of some kind?
I think they would probably do both. Okay, do you think that got through okay to the... Yeah, so the question was, there's a Franciscan facility in downtown DC, and what might a retreat be like if you went there? I think it could be about anything, okay? I think you're talking about, it's called the monastery, it's a Franciscan monastery of the Holy Land or something. There's a couple of Franciscan monasteries in Washington, D.C. When I was studying theology, I was within what was called a coalition of different religious orders, and there were Franciscans in there. The Franciscan order has possibly been maybe aside from the Benedictines, the most reformed order in the history of the Catholic Church. So we have the Franciscans, we have the Capuchins, we have all sorts of different Franciscan offshoots that have come out of Francis. And part of that was because as the Franciscan order grew and as it became more assimilated into the church, many of its members felt like the original spirit was lost. So all of these reforms were an attempt to go back to the initial religious spirit of Francis. I remember a Franciscan professor, when I was studying theology, talking about a cartoon that had circulated in a Franciscan publication in which Francis is dying, and there's all these different orders of Franciscans trying to get Francis into their habit, okay? Because they were the truest, exemplars of his thinking. Anyone else?
You go, Betsy.
Mine isn't a question, it's just an anecdote. We were in Rio de Janeiro, and they have a beautiful cathedral there. And on the grounds of the cathedral, we were walking around, and they showed us, they said this was, you were talking about Pope Francis and how he took the name and tried to help or align himself with the marginalized. And when Francis was in Rio at this cathedral, he gave them a gift, and it's a full-size sculpture. It's a bench, and on the bench is a homeless person wrapped in a blanket. And it is just, it hits you, pretty hard. It's pretty wonderful to see.
Right, yeah.
Francis' whole ministry.
Hang on a second.
Commenting on that for just a moment, Francis' ministry in Buenos Aires was to the marginalized population there, so that made him a little bit different than some of the other popes.
Exactly.
Come out more mainstream.
Exactly.
And he really does exemplify that rather well. I have lots of questions about Franciscans. I won't say. The only thing I'll make a comment about is that the local Roman Catholic Church in Herndon, their priests are Franciscans.
Yeah, they're third order regular. That's another TORs. That's another reform movement.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the history of religious life within the Catholic Church is one in which just about every order has had a reform movement in it, and some of those reform movements have broken away into separate orders, really.
But I was interested in talking to the priest there because I mentioned I was in California, so he asked me about the Santa Barbara mission. So I don't know what the relationship, because he's seen some close alliance to the mission in Santa Barbara.
Okay.
Which was founded by that was Junípero Serra's group when they
Exactly.
So I don't know.
Yeah, and I should know if Junípero Serra was Franciscan. For some reason I don't think he was, but
Junípero Serra was.
he was. Okay. Well,
yeah,
then all those missions were founded by Franciscans.
I don't know what. Are you Jesuit, Ron?
No, Carmelite.
Carmelite. Okay.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. All the missionaries that came to California were Franciscans because there'd been a falling out with the Jesuits who were in Baja California.
Okay.
So they got thrown out, and the Franciscans made their way to Alta California.
Okay.
So all 21 missions were
Right.
Franciscan.
And of course, if you remember, the Franciscans were not particularly covering themselves with glory in all of those missions. The way they treated the Indians would have been. No, that's true. But the point is that was pretty far removed from Francis's notion of things. Anyone else? Oh.
No, I got it. Are there Franciscan churches?
Well, there would be churches staffed by Franciscans. And that's the way in the Catholic Church, the way it works is all the churches are kind of owned by the bishop, but the bishop will, there's not enough diocesan clergy, and so religious orders will staff different churches. And, that could be, forever or at a certain point, because vocations in general have gone down. So I can only speak from the Carmelites. One of the churches that I served in eventually went back to the diocese because there just weren't enough Carmelites to continue to staff it. So there are churches that are traditionally associated with Franciscans. Anyone else?
Our own Giovanni Tagnisi, who's Gio is a lay reader and a newcomer to St. Timothy's. He is, I want to get the nomenclature right, a postulant, a novice maybe, in the third order secular Franciscans. And so you, as a layperson, you can join and become a secular Franciscan, and he's doing that. And the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, has that as well. So,
Right. He had started in fact, I talked with him before I put this lecture together to make sure that there weren't some things I might have been missing. But he had started that process in the Catholic Church before he came to St. Tim's. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much. Next week, we've got 2 Carmelite saints, because I couldn't decide which of them to do, so I'm doing both of them at the same time, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And they are very closely related in their thinking and were quite well known to each other during their lifetime. So, see you then.